Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here in CIAPS, Commonwealth Institute for Advanced Professional Studies. And today we are going to provide an overview of criminology. One could even say an introduction to criminology. As usual, I'll try to represent all points of view and all schools and the debates within the profession. And hopefully I will give you a panoramic view because the many issues are not settled. There is some kind of background noise. I think one of the participants has an issue with earphones or laptop or something. Okay, hopefully it's gone. One should bear in mind that criminology is a relatively new discipline. It's even newer than psychology. And consequently, it is in its adolescence phase. Let's start with the following. There is currently a television series. It is titled Adolescence. Everyone is talking about it. It's a British television series. In this television series, a 13-year-old boy stabs with a knife his female classmate. Now, the 13-year-old boy is under the influence of misogynistic influences on YouTube and so on and so forth. He is also being bullied by the victim of the murder prior to the murder, egregiously and repeatedly. And so this kind of crime is actually reactive crime. It's a crime that is provoked by prior behavior of the victim. And within this context of provoked reactive crime, this raises multiple questions. For example, would this boy have behaved the same way or misbehaved the same way had he not been provoked? Had he not been egregiously maltreated and abused repeatedly? This is one class of crime, reactive crime. Then we have voluntary crime. Evidently, if someone takes a knife and stabs another person to death without any provocation, without any background, the other person being a stranger, although technically this is exactly the same crime, stabbing, obviously it's not the same crime or not the same type of crime. So we should make a distinction between reactive crime and voluntary crime. But there is even a third type of crime, the conforming or contextual crime. Consider, for example, terrorists, member of terrorist organizations, such as ISIS, or previous to that Al-Qaeda, and so on and so forth. These people do not consider themselves to be criminals. They conform to an ethos, to what they believe to be, erroneously, religious teachings. They are embedded in networks of peers. All of them adhere to the same tenets and the same beliefs. So the crime in this case, although objectively, definitely is an offense, the crimes committed by terrorists are somehow contextualized. The terrorists are actually conforming to social expectations and mores within their peer group. So it is not true, it is not good to discuss all crimes as if they have some kind of universal common denominator. They do not. Crimes, typical crimes, the crimes that are in the criminal code of most countries, are opportunistic. When people see an opportunity, they commit crimes. And pay attention, I'm using the word people judiciously. I didn't say when criminals see an opportunity, they commit a crime. I said when people see an opportunity, they commit a crime. Crime is a natural reaction of the vast majority of humanity, vast majority of people, when they're confronted with an opportunity. I refer you to studies by Ariely, now a bit discredited, but still, studies where Ariely actually created situations in which The majority of students in the tests, in the experiments, in the studies, ended up cheating, ended up committing a breach of ethics or even a crime. Crime is a reaction to opportunity. We know from another field, the field of studies of infidelity, that people commit infidelity not because they're attracted to the potential partner, but because they see an opportunity. The main determinant in cheating, in infidelity, is the availability of the other partner. So opportunity is a major motivator of crime. Crime, as I mentioned, sometimes is a conformist act, not a rebellious act, but on the very contrary, a kind of signaling, a kind of belonging, a kind of acceptance. If you grow up in certain environments, if you're embedded in certain environments, for example, in slums or in prisons, you're much more likely to commit crimes just in order to be accepted, for example, in a gang. So it is not true to say that crime is antisocial. In many, many cases, crime is pro-social. It is done, it is committed in order to conform to social expectations and to belong to a social group. All crime involves a misappraisal of risk and reward. The vast majority of criminals do not gauge risks appropriately and exaggerate their rewards. They minimize the risk and they overvalue the reward. And this erroneous calculus of risk versus reward leads them to behave in ways which are essentially self-defeating and self-destructive. Although crime pays, actually the statistics are shocking. Less than 6% of offenders in some countries, for example, the United Kingdom, less than 6% of offenders end up getting caught. 94% of offenses go either unreported or unpunished. Crime definitely is a rational choice. Crime involves impulsivity in some cases and planning in other cases. Another reason to not lump together all crimes. There is no universal category of crime, of criminality. This is completely wrong. As I said, some crimes require a lot of planning, a lot of foresight, a lot of analytical skills, a lot of investment, and a lot of knowledge. Other crimes are on the spur of the moment. They're impulsive. The criminal is out of control. All criminals feel entitled. They feel entitled to property. They feel entitled to sex. They feel entitled to power. There's a sense of entitlement. And the entitlement is incommensurate with the characteristics and traits of the criminal, the education of the criminal, the skills of the criminal, and the accomplishments of the criminal. The entitlement is there not because the criminal somehow attained a certain position, but because the criminal feels narcissistically that he or she is entitled to a shortcut. There's no need to invest, no need to work, no need to study hard. It's magical thinking. If I just wish something, I should immediately have it. And if I do not have it, I have a right to aggress against other people. Entitlement is, of course, one of the core clinical features of pathological narcissism. And indeed, studies have repeatedly shown that a sizable portion of criminals have or suffer from narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder, also known in extreme cases as psychopathy. Crime, therefore, may be a form of mental illness, however attenuated. Crime is ego-syntonic. In other words, the criminal, in most cases, feels good about himself or herself, feels good about his actions, and feels good about the choices and decisions that he makes. Most criminals, however, feel bad about the outcomes or consequences of their actions and choices when they go wrong. So there is a kind of gap here. While the criminal considers himself to be superior in some way, even sometimes morally superior, I'm justified in what I'm doing, I deserve this. And while the criminal feels good with himself, he feels that in some way the crime elevates him, that it is a kind of art form. The criminal is proud professionally of the skills the criminal skills that he has acquired over a lifetime of crime. At the same time, most criminals bemoan and complain about the inevitable self-destructive, self-harming, and self-defeating consequences of their actions. Again, only in the minority of cases. Criminals are playing against the odds. They are like in a sempiternal casino. They place bets on their criminal acts because they know that in the majority of cases they stand to benefit and will never be punished. Criminals, therefore, have something we call alloplastic defenses. Alloplastic defenses is when you tend to blame other people, the environment, your personal history, your parents, the state, the police, you name it. Blame others for your choices, your decisions, your behaviors, and the consequences of your behaviors. So everyone else is guilty. You never are. You're not accountable. You should not be held accountable. You should not be responsible because it's not your fault. This is called alloplastic defenses. I'm describing to you the features that are common to all criminals. Shortly, I will go into distinctions between types of crimes, the motivations and the psychology of types of crimes. But right now, everything I'm saying is common to all criminals. Street criminals, white-collar criminals, terrorists, you name it. All of them share these features. Crime becomes a habit. And in many cases, crime is a lifelong career. It's habituated. When people engage in crime on a regular basis, it becomes reflexive. It becomes an automatic, non-controllable reaction, a mode of interacting with the environment and communicating with other people. Crime, therefore, has a very strong element of language and signaling, exactly like sex. Sex is a form of communication and a form of signaling. It's a language. Same with crime. Exactly like many other human behaviors. Sometimes the crime is about conveying some signal, conveying some message, conveying some information. We could say, therefore, that some types of crime are symbolic. They revolve around symbols and the manipulation of symbols and the attempt to communicate symbolic action and behaviors to other people. Rape would be an example. In the case of rape, it's not about sex at all. It's about power asymmetry. The rapist acquires power over the victim. Similarly, the serial killer acquires power over the victim. These are manifestations of a power matrix or power asymmetry. The rapist and the serial killer are communicating to the victim, to the police, to the media, to the community at large, I am superior, I am powerful, I have power over you. All you have to do is read the correspondence by Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer to understand what I'm saying. Both of them regarded their crimes as some kind of symbolic action. And of course, the Unabomber, the famous Ted Kaczynski Unabomber, he actually constructed these crimes as a form of symbolic protest against the industrial capitalist system, which is destroying the world, according to him. He published a manifesto in the New York Times and other major newspapers where he explained his terrorist activities as a kind of message. The symbolic aspect of crime should not be underestimated. It's very important. Crime, any type of crime, requires training, education, skills. And in this sense, crime is very reminiscent of acquiring a profession, of developing a career. There's a career path in crime. Studies by Moffitt and others discovered that criminals tend to escalate their crimes. So they start with very low-level crimes like shoplifting or this kind of thing, and they escalate and escalate and escalate, and they end up with armed burglary or even murder. Crime is escalatory because the more training, exposure, experience, education, and skills you acquire as a criminal, the more tempted you are to evolve, to progress, to climb the criminal ladder. Because in crime, among criminals, there is a hierarchy. Murderers are at the top, rapists are at the bottom. There is a scale of a reputational scale. Criminals, the criminal subculture is a shame-based subculture, is a reputation-based subculture. It's all about saving face. It's all about showing respect. All you have to do is watch the famous Godfather movies of the 1970s and 80s, where you see what an inordinate amount of time and resources criminals invest in safeguarding their dignity, their respect, and somehow establishing immediately hierarchies, who would bend to who would kowtow to who, and so on and so forth. So crime is hierarchical, and it has its own culture, its own language, its own educational path, its own career ladder. It's a totally parallel universe. It's a parallel world. Now is the time, I think, to begin to be a little more discerning in analyzing criminal activity. I gave you an overview. This overview is valid for all types of crimes, as I mentioned. And now, let's begin to delve deeper. The first major debate in criminology is, who is to blame? Who is guilty? Is it the criminal? Or is it the criminal's society and environment? Is it something in the criminal that pushes him to commit crimes? Is it something bred or inherent or hereditary, or maybe a choice, maybe a voluntary decision because the criminal is evil? Is it something in the personality of the criminal that pushes the criminal inexorably to commit crimes? Or is the criminal a victim of societal circumstances, environmental deprivation, bad upbringing, abuse and trauma in early childhood, and so on? And there is a huge debate, undecided debate, in criminology between these two approaches. The problem we have in coming to decide this debate and other debates, the problem we have is that the sample of criminals to which we have access as scholars, as psychologists, as psychiatrists, the sample of criminals is non-representative. You see, the criminals in prison, the criminals in courtrooms, the criminals who have been apprehended and captured by the police, they're the failures. They're the stupid ones. They're the ones who didn't make it. And they do not represent the total criminal world. They are a group of criminals that can tell us very little about, for example, successful criminals, career criminals, white-collar criminals, criminal politicians, criminals in networks like pedophile networks. We rarely get a glimpse into these criminal activities. What we are faced with are criminals who are basically psychopaths or narcissists. They have very low IQ. That's a fact. And I will come to the description of this subgroup. But it's important to understand that this is a subgroup, a non-representative sample. We must make a distinction between street crime and sweet crime, like corporate sweet, white collar crime. Actually, when we study the data, the little data that is available to us via this non-representative group of failed criminals, when we study this data, we discover that street crime, the kind of crimes we hear about, like murder, rape, manslaughter, this kind of crimes, drug-related crimes, these crimes have nothing to do with white-collar crime, what we call the sweet crime. Nothing to do. There's no common denominator between the two. And yet, both of them involve breaking the law. Both of them involve a breach of societal norms and conventions and mores and expectations. Both of them are defiant in this way. Both of them rely on magical thinking. I'm going to get away with it. Still, the demographic profile of criminals in either of these two groups and the psychological profile has very little in common. Let's start with some basic demographic statistical facts about crime. All crime, street crime and sweet crime. Crime is much more common than you think. Actually, something between 2/3 and 3/4 of people, and you heard the numbers correctly, 67% to 76% of people would commit a crime in their lifetime. Crime, therefore, is not the exception. It's the rule. It's not abnormal. It's very normal and very common. Everyone is a criminal. Everyone commits a crime. The other 25% probably were never caught. Crime is not normative. In other words, crime flies in the face of societal norms and conventions, but it is highly normal. Actually, crime is one of the most common behaviors in human populations and cohorts, much more common than other behaviors. I will give you one number which may shock you. Crime is much more common than sexual activity, especially among young people. Okay, 20 to 40% of criminals are men. 20 to 40% of men commit crimes. 20 to 40% of men commit crimes, and these are the men that we catch. These are the men that got apprehended or detained or arrested by the police. They have a criminal record. Of people with criminal record, the vast majority are men. A small minority are women. Only 10 to 15% of women commit crimes and have been apprehended. So men are 3 times more likely to offend than women. And we ask ourselves, why is that? Does it have anything to do with hormones? Because we know that men have more testosterone than women. Is it testosterone? Testosterone leads to violent behavior, aggression, and so on. Is it because society rewards and encourages aggressive behavior by men, by males? It is in some settings like the army and the police, it is considered even pro-social, communal, a good thing. The linkage between masculinity and aggression, or even masculinity and violence, is millennia old, and maybe it got somehow cemented into the ethos of what it means to be a man. Maybe it is epigenetics. A population that engages in a highly specific behaviors would tend to activate specific genes. These genes would express themselves more commonly. And Some studies indicate that this activation, this gene expression, would be passed down the generations. Maybe. No one knows the answer. This is the foundational fact in criminology, that men offend considerably more than women, and no one knows why. You understand in what primitive state the discipline is, which is good for you because it means you can innovate and acquire a name in the field. We have studies of self-reporting studies where we ask people, did you commit a crime? And in these studies, the results are mind-boggling. 80% of people claim to have committed a crime. The other 20% are lying, probably. 80% in self-reporting questionnaires report having committed at least one punishable crime in a lifetime. Double the population that is caught and is in prison. Triple if we believe that 100% commit crimes. Crime, the types of crime, are related to age. We call it age crime curve. So for example, violent crimes, aggressive crimes, drugs, the famous crimes that we know of, they're committed by young people, predominantly young people. White-collar crimes are committed by predominantly middle-aged and older people. Age has a lot to do, not with the diminishment of crime only, but has a lot to do with the type of crime chosen by the criminal. Age seems to reduce street crime, violent crime, crime that involves using the body, but enhances white-collar crime, crimes that require the use of the brain. It's from brawn to brain, it seems, and we call it the age crime curve. Now, I mentioned that men commit more crimes than women, but there are a few unpleasant, politically incorrect facts which I have to share with you. One of them is that poor people commit more crimes than wealthy people. Or at least, let me qualify this, poor people commit more street crime than well-off people, wealthy people. Well-off people and wealthy people commit more white-collar crime than poor people. Inevitably, they have access. Poor people don't have access. Similarly, black people commit considerably more crime than white people, where there is a mixed population in which allows for comparison. So generally speaking, blacks offend much more than whites, much more often than whites, much more frequently than whites, and so on. But this is an extremely misleading statistic. Generally, the picture is that blacks commit more crimes than whites, but if you break it down according to socioeconomic brackets, you discover that blacks commit exactly the same number of crimes per capita as do whites. It's a myth. It's a common myth. And it leads to misbehaviors like police profiling and racism and so on. But in the same socioeconomic group, whites and blacks commit crimes at the same rate. It so happens that blacks are overrepresented in lower socioeconomic groups, and consequently, they commit more crimes. I mentioned white-collar crimes. White-collar crimes are committed by white people. The vast majority of white criminals are white. They are older, at least 35 years old, usually 40 and 50 years old. They're men, mainly because women are denied the opportunity, denied the access, which would allow them to commit white-collar crime, and they're well off. So we see a totally different profile. Now let's talk a bit about the psychology of criminals. I mentioned a few elements in the psychology of criminals earlier. Let's discuss a few additional elements. Criminals are defiant. They have what we call oppositional reactance. Oppositional reactance is in your face, my way or the highway. I'm not going to obey you. I'm not going to listen to you. You won't tell me what to do. I will do whatever it is that I want to do. I am in charge. I am the boss, etc., etc. We call this oppositional reactance. And the criminal directs his or her oppositional reactance both towards other criminals in group and towards non-criminals out group. The oppositional reactance of the typical criminal is comprised of defiance, contumaciousness, rejection of authority, and externalized aggression. One of the characteristics of a criminal is the incredibly rapid transition, the alacrity of the transition from stimulus or trigger or provocation to aggression, and the escalation of aggression to violence. That is typical only of criminals. It seems that impulse control is compromised in criminals. But all of them are defiant. All of them are oppositional. All of them are a law unto themselves. I am the law. And this, of course, is an excellent description. I'm sorry, someone is talking and I can hear it. And this is, of course, an excellent description of antisocial personality disorder, also known in extreme cases as psychopathy. It stands to reason that all criminals share some trait domains and some characteristics of a psychopath. They're psychopathic, if not psychopaths. They're either subclinical psychopaths or actual psychopaths. And yet, at the same time, there is a kind of paradox. Whereas the typical criminal is defiant, my way or the highway, will not tell me what to do, they are also highly suggestible, highly reactive to peer group pressure and peer influence. When the criminal is embedded among other criminals, the frequency and the intensity of criminal action increases. When the criminal is exposed to other criminals, the criminal commits many more crimes than when the criminal is exposed to non-criminals. It seems that the peer group of the criminal, other criminals, it has a huge impact on the criminal's choices, on the criminal's actions, and on the committing of crimes. Peer influence. And yet, it presents a contradiction. If you are a lone wolf, if you're a loner, if you are your own law, if you're a law unto yourself, if no one can tell you what to do, if you are defiant and you hate authority, you're this and you're that, how come you're so influenced so easily, so suggestively by other criminals? How come the presence of other criminals triggers you, motivates you, provokes you into committing crimes? We don't know the answer. We know, for example, that you are far more likely to become a criminal if you grow up in a family where one of the siblings is also a criminal, or in a family where the father is a criminal, or the mother is a criminal, let alone both parents and siblings. So it seems the environment, the number of criminals in your environment has a massive influence on whether you would become a criminal, how would your criminal activity escalate, and how many crimes you would commit. This is peer pressure or peer influence. Antisocial personality disorder seems to be, in this particular case, an adaptation, an attempt to fit into the environment, to curry favor, to ingratiate yourself with others, to belong, to be accepted, and to motivate others to collaborate with you and cooperate and work with you. Antisocial behavior, unfortunately, is, in many cases, lifelong. Now, antisocial behavior does not have to be criminal. Many criminals stop committing crimes when they grow older. We'll discuss it a bit later. This is called desistance. But all criminals remain antisocial. For example, they remain defiant. They remain hateful towards authority. They are influenced by peers. So these antisocial clinical features are usually lifelong. Actually, there is a mental health diagnosis known as conduct disorder. Conduct disorder is psychopathy for children. Children diagnosed with conduct disorder, in 40% of the cases, become adult psychopaths. So conduct disorder is a precursor of adult psychopathy. A child with conduct disorder is going to torture animals, is going to violently aggress or attack other children, is going to defy authority. In other words, a child with conduct disorder already has most of the traits and the clinical features of an adult psychopath. Criminal activity continues well into one's 30s and 40s and abates only in one's 40s and 50s. But there is a subgroup of criminals, and not a small one, not a small minority, which regard crime as a career choice and continue to offend throughout the lifespan until they're 80, in their 80s and 90s, or what have you. They never stop. They never cease. And one of the main conundrums in criminology is how can we tell the difference between lifespan criminals who offend until they die, and criminals who suddenly stop when they're in their 30s and 40s. In other words, what is the engine of desistance? Desistance means to stop committing crimes. We don't know the answer to this. Another major question which we don't know the answer to. And so, repeat offenders, also known as persistent offenders, chronic offenders, career offenders, these career criminals have a few things in common. We discovered in psychological studies that there is a profile of a repeat offender, of a career criminal. Number one, low IQ. Now I know that this is going to shock you, because when you watch crime, even true crime, television series, you see criminals who are super cunning, amazingly scheming, smart, and hyper intelligent. And then there's the detective or the psychologist, and they kind of have it out, battle it out, brain against brain. But that's not reality. The overwhelming vast majority of career criminals who offend throughout the lifespan, all life long, the overwhelming majority of them have an IQ that qualifies them to be diagnosed as intellectually challenged. Their IQ, on average, is between 60 and 90. Next thing is hyperactivity. I'm describing now the common denominators, the common psychological denominators of all career criminals, repeat offenders, persistent, chronic criminals. So I mentioned low IQ, hyperactivity, the hyperactive, the bored. All of them report boredom. They're constantly bored. They need to stimulate themselves somehow. They need drama. And they generate the drama by committing crimes. Crime gives them an adrenaline rush. If the crime succeeds, it's a dopamine rush. One could describe career criminals as internalized junkies. They are junkies of neurotransmitters and neuromodulators and hormones secreted internally inside the brain, inside the body. They're addicted to norepinephrine, adrenaline, and dopamine, for example. So they're addicts. They're junkies of hyperactivity and drama. Next thing, all of them have poor impulse control. The first thought that comes to their minds, they immediately act on it. They don't stop to analyze, to think, to consider the consequences and the outcomes, to ask themselves, is it going to be worth it? Is it worth it? No. They think about something, to do something, they do it immediately. This is impaired impulse control. And one of the elements in this impulsivity or impulsiveness is magical thinking. This type of criminal, and frankly most criminals, they have something called magical thinking. They believe that somehow they're going to end up exempt. Somehow they will not be punished. They will not pay the price for their misconduct. They will not be exposed. They will not be discovered. They will not have to pay for anything. And they also believe, most criminals also believe, that their wishes, if they just think hard enough about something, if they just want something hard enough, it's going to happen. They believe that they can manifest somehow in the environment. Crime has a lot to do with magic. It's a kind of black magic. The criminal act transforms the world so that the world gives the criminal a gift. Criminal feels entitled to all the gifts of the world, and crime is the way to obtain these gifts. But prior to crime, there is an urge, a drive, an impulse that the criminal cannot control. When we look at the background of criminals, especially lifelong criminals, but not only, we discover poor parenting. Most criminals have been subjected to what we call adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. Adverse childhood experiences could include domestic violence, neglect, abuse, even trauma, all types of abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and so on and so forth. In the majority of criminals, backgrounds of criminals, personal history, we do have these elements. We also discovered that in most cases, criminals have been subjected to prenatal abuse, abuse before they were born, abuse in the womb. So the mothers of most criminals consumed drugs, or were alcoholics, or mistreated the embryo somehow. There was a mistreatment that preceded the birth in the majority of cases of criminals. We're beginning to see that poor prenatal care, for example, wrong nutrition or deficient nutrition, substance abuse, as I mentioned, poor prenatal care predisposes some people to become criminals. And then, of course, they're born into dysfunctional families or into bad parents, dysfunctional parents, and the cycle continues unbroken. And so here we are now considering environmental dimensions. One of the major criminologists in the world is Terry Moffit. Moffit is M-O-F-F-I-T, like Muppet, only with F. Terry Moffit studied criminology all her life, and so she came up with a scheme, a taxonomy, a nosology, a classification of criminals and crimes, and she said there are two types of criminals. She called one type, she called the adolescent limited criminal, and the other one is the life course persistent criminal. She said that the adolescent limited criminal is a criminal who starts to offend in early adolescence. And this kind of criminal peters out. This kind of criminal abandons the life of crime in his 20s or 30s. The other type of criminal, the life course persistent criminal, starts to offend usually later, actually, although many of them start in late adolescence, but continues to offend lifelong. It knows no better, or it doesn't want to know better. Crime is very alluring because the gratification is immediate, and there is a disproportionality between the investment of resources and the beneficial outcomes. So, for example, if you rob a bank, you end up with $1 million, something that would have taken you 30 years to accumulate if you're very lucky. So there's a disproportionality of outcomes that leads to instant gratification on a scale that is not available in any other human activity except perhaps entrepreneurship. And many people would say that entrepreneurs are a bit antisocial, if not criminalized. Some entrepreneurs, of course, I'm not generalizing. So the life course persistent criminal is an addict. It's an addictive personality. And he is addicted to this disproportionality. He's addicted. It's like gambling in a casino. You know, you put one chip and you get back. If you win, you get back 36. And this is very addictive. And consequently, lifelong criminals tend to escalate. As I mentioned, they graduate from one type of crime to a more serious crime, and from a more serious crime to a more grave crime, and it goes on, and many of them end up as murderers. Crime is opportunistic, and when it is coupled with escalation, there's no end, there's no limit to what the career criminal can do. But luckily for us, as a society, as humanity, the majority of criminals end their criminal careers in their 40s and 50s. Criminality abates, and they simply stop. That's a fact. Similarly, we know from clinical psychology that most psychopaths lose the diagnosis. They stop being psychopaths in their 40s and 50s. Most people with borderline personality disorder, which also sometimes leads, this kind of personality disorder also sometimes leads to crime, especially violent crime and aggressive crime. We also know that people with borderline personality disorder lose the diagnosis in their 40s. So it's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that psychopaths cease to be psychopaths in their 40s. Borderlines are no longer borderlines in their 40s, and criminals no longer offend and no longer commit crimes in their 40s. The linkage is clear. Again, I'm proposing to you that crime may be a form of mental illness, actually. Of course, we can have temporary or transient mental illness, which would explain why the vast majority of humanity commit crimes at one point or another. But this is a transient phase, a temporary phase in majority of people. They commit a crime and they forget about it. And most of these crimes are committed in adolescence and in early 20s, when the brain is not fully developed yet, impulse control is just forming, instant gratification is sought, and so on. So the profile of someone in his teenage years and his 20s is not the same as the profile of that very same person in his 40s or 50s. There is an approach in criminology known as the biosocial approach. The biosocial approach makes a series of assumptions. None of these assumptions, I'm sorry to say, is substantiated. None of them is evidence-based. I would therefore call them speculations. So the biosocial approach claims that criminality is inherited, that there is a hereditary genetic component that predisposes people to commit crimes. Is there any proof of that? No, not yet. The biosocial approach also claims that criminality forms in the womb, that criminals have been subjected to the wrong type of pregnancy. They were not given the right food as embryos, which affected their brains. The mother abused drugs and substances, which again affected the brain, and so on and so forth. That's another assumption. We know that this happens to be true, yet we were unable yet at this stage to quantify the impact in some meaningful way, to measure the correlations or the causation of these alleged vectors of crime transmission. There have been studies of psychopaths, the brains of psychopaths. And we know that psychopaths, the brains of psychopaths, are abnormal. That's a fact, well established in multiple studies over more than 80 years. So we know the brains of psychopaths are abnormal. There is a disparity in gray matter versus white matter. There is underactivation of the amygdala, the seat of emotions. There are severe problems with the prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of judgment and maturity and so on, and thinking, cognition. So the brains of psychopaths are impaired. They're impaired structurally, and they don't function well. They're dysfunctional. They're functionally impaired. And we also know that many psychopaths are criminals. And we also know that most criminals have psychopathic traits and features, clinical features. The linkage between psychopathy and criminality seems to me at least to be ironclad. And if the brains of psychopaths are defective or deformed or deficient, this would explain a lot. This would come a long way towards explaining why criminals offend. I mentioned earlier that you may regard criminality as a form of mental illness, and if you link mental illness to brain abnormalities, this closes the circle. Brain abnormalities form, maybe in the womb, maybe afterwards, owing to abuse and trauma. These brain abnormalities engender or foster psychopathy and borderline personality disorder. These personality disorders then lead to criminal behavior, and then the abnormalities of the brain are directly linked to offending and offenses. There's an affective dysregulation. This kind of brain cannot regulate emotions and impulses. This kind of brain creates volatility and lability. This kind of brain is out of control, literally. We know that psychopaths actually suffer from anxiety disorder. It's a new discovery. But we are beginning to think that psychopaths also suffer from emotional dysregulation, that they react to emotions when they're confronted with emotions, when they experience emotions. They react to it by becoming impulsive and aggressive. They aggress against their own overwhelming emotions. In order to not be overwhelmed, in order to not be paralyzed by their own emotions, in order to not freeze, they aggress, they externalize aggression. Now this is much more typical of borderline personality disorder, and indeed there are scholars who suggest that borderline personality disorder, people with borderline, let's call them borderlines for short, borderlines, when they act out, actually become secondary psychopaths. The borderline, when she's confronted with rejection, humiliation, abandonment, stress, tension, and anxiety, the borderline then externalizes aggression, becomes reckless and defiant, indistinguishable from a secondary psychopath, and this is the process known as acting out. So the linkages are very clear to my mind. The dysregulation, the impulsiveness, the recklessness, the lack of self-control, the defiance, the externalized aggression, reaching the point of violence very often, and the criminality they all seem to be some kind of defense or decompensation, disintegration of the personality when confronted with stressors and with exigencies and with triggers which overwhelm the system. We know that criminals, the criminals that we have studied, have all been in prison. Mind you, it's not a representative sample. These people have ended up in prison for good reason. They were more reckless. They took greater risks than other criminals. They were risk seekers. They had poor judgment. They had poor problem-solving capacity. This is typical of criminals in prison. Is it typical of criminals who have never been caught? Is it typical of criminals who stay out of prison for the majority of their lives? We don't know, because these criminals, we have no access to them. We couldn't test them. And so the work of someone like Robert Hare, for example, one of the major figures in the study of psychopathy, is nice, is fascinating, teaches us a lot about psychopaths behind bars. He was a prison psychologist for most of his career, but teaches me nothing about the typical criminal. Because the typical criminal never finds himself behind bars, never gets caught, never gets punished. Fact. Okay. We are therefore faced with yet another conundrum. And again, the nascent discipline of criminology has no answer. And today, I bring you many questions and very few answers. Don't be mad at me. The reason is there are no answers. So the next conundrum in criminology is crime or criminality is the tendency to commit crime. Is it a predisposition? Is it a predestination? Or is it a choice? This is a super critical question. Because, for example, if it is a choice, we need to punish even more severely to provide incentives not to adopt this choice. The more egregious the punishment, the more extreme, the more cruel the punishment, ostensibly, this would have an impact on the decision-making process and would convince wannabe criminals, would-be criminals, to make different choices. This is if we believe that criminality is a choice. But what if criminality is a predisposition? There's a genetic template, and this genetic engine, this genetic fuel, this genetic driver causes the criminal to offend. Then the very concept of punishment is counterintuitive and unjust. Why would you punish the criminal if the criminal is just the hapless slave and toy of a genetic template? Why would you punish the criminal if crime is inexorable, unstoppable, uncontrollable? Why would you punish the criminal if it was not the outcome of choice, but the outcome of an accident of the lottery of genetics and heredity? Why then should the criminal be punished? And of course there is the concept of predestination in some religious circles. For example, Calvinism, which is a branch of Protestantism, assumes that all human actions on earth are predetermined. This is called predestination. So, if actions are determined in advance, if we are but programmed machines that play out the program as we live, then what is the role and justification for punishment? So the whole question of the punitive penalty-based system, penitentiaries, the whole question now is much less certain. We feel much less convinced that we're doing the right thing by punishing criminals. And this gave rise, in the 60s and 70s, this gave rise to the school of rehabilitation. We don't need to punish criminals because, first of all, they are only partly responsible for their crimes. So we don't need to punish them. It's unjust. And also, punishment would be ineffective because the criminal is not in control. There would be no behavior modification in this case. So what we should do, what we need to do, we need to rehabilitate the criminal. We need to change the criminal's environment, which is conducive to crime, the peers and siblings and family that encourage a criminal to offend. We need to provide the criminal with an alternative environment with alternative incentives and stimuli, for example, the educational system, or a workplace, or another neighborhood, or whatever. And at the same time, we need to teach the criminal ways to control otherwise uncontrollable impulses, to counter his programming, genetic or otherwise. So this was a school of rehabilitation. And what we keep doing over the past few decades is a pendulum. There are decades where we support rehabilitation. And then punishment, legal punishment in the courts is much more lenient. There are programs for drug offenders, and to rehabilitate them somehow, we provide substitute for drugs, so this is the rehabilitation approach. And then there is the pendulum swings back, and again we want to be punitive, the capital punishment, to put people in prison for life on minor offenses, and so on and so forth. Tough on crime or tough on the criminal. These are the two options. And we can't make up our minds. We can't make up our minds because criminology and clinical psychology do not provide us with answers. Not even a hint of an answer. So we don't know what is the correct approach. And the experience we have accumulated via the penal system and via the rehabilitative system, this experience is so contradictory that it teaches us basically nothing, confuses us even more. Adrian Raine, R-A-I-N-E, is a neurocriminologist. It's a new discipline. And Adrian Raine came with the idea of what he calls social push, social-push, like two alternatives, social and push. He says that we should assume that there is a genetic, biological, or bioneurological component in criminality, but at the same time accept that the environment can trigger this predisposing factor, that there is a synergy between the environment and the equipment of the criminal mind, that people can be biologically predisposed to crime but never commit a crime because they found themselves in a good, embracing, nurturing environment. Or people can have very few predisposing factors, but the environment pushes them to offend. It's the social push idea is interesting, but sorry to say, nothing new. It's a renaming and rebranding of previous theories and so on, which is unfortunately very common in the social sciences. Everyone who wants to make a name for himself or herself simply renames or rebrands existing knowledge, and it doesn't add anything new. Everyone knew long before Mr. Raine or Dr. Raine or whatever, everyone knew that crime and criminality, it's an interplay between the mind of the criminal and the environment of the criminal. Everyone knew that. I don't see anything new in this. A more promising angle or dimension would be the study of desistance. If we cannot answer the question, why do criminals commit crimes? And hitherto we failed abysmally and dismally. We have no answers. Then maybe we can answer the question, why do criminals cease to commit crimes? Why do they stop? Not why do they start, not why do they continue, which we have failed to answer, but why do they stop? This is known as desistance. Similarly, the flip coin of this question is, why do they continue? Like, why do they re-offend? So desistance and recidivism. The study of desistance and recidivism may give us clues as to what is the locomotive behind the criminal mind. What distinguishes the criminal mind from the non-criminal mind? And we're talking now about constantly offending, constant offenders. As I mentioned before, and I'm going to mention again, every human being alive has committed a crime in his or her lifetime. I know that most of you would say that's not true. I have never committed a crime. Go back home, soul search, read your diaries, revisit your memories, and you will discover that you have committed a crime. Small, big, but you have. I'm not talking about these kind of people. Not talking about all of us. I'm talking about the career criminal. When we talk about the career criminal, we don't know what makes the career criminal a career criminal. We don't know why. What drives the criminal mind? But we can ask the question, why do they stop? And we can ask the question, why, having spent time in prison, do they re-offend? Why do they do that? One obvious answer is that desistance, to remind you, is when the criminal does not offend anymore, stops offending. One thing we know, and I mentioned it before, is that desistance has something to do with aging. Now, aging is a highly complex process that involves everything from the brain to hormones to multiple systems and psychology, of course, and so on. And there are many scholars, medical scholars, who believe that aging is a disease, actually, that should be cured one day. So there's a debate about aging, and there's a debate about crime. And you put the two together, you get one hell of a mess. Yet we know that when people get older, whatever that may mean, when they age, whatever that may mean, the frequency of criminal activity is dramatically reduced to the point of desistance. What is it in aging that causes a criminal to no longer be a criminal? We know, for example, in the male body, there is a precipitous drop in the quantity of testosterone. When a man ages, reaches my age, the man almost no longer produces testosterone. And we also know that testosterone is the hormone involved in aggressive behavior and so on. Maybe that's the explanation. But maybe the explanation is maturation. Aging is linked to life experience and episodic memory. In other words, the longer you live, the more experiences you have. And maybe these experiences have taught you something, conditioned you at least. If you have a low IQ, if you're stupid, if you're dumb, even as a criminal, maybe you've learned something as a kind of conditioning. You see in many movies, Hollywood movies and so on, you see a criminal says, I am never going back to prison. I would rather die, but I'm never going back to prison. That's a kind of criminal who has learned something. There's been a process of learning. Prison may be perceived as a kind of higher education institution for criminals because there they acquire the degree and the knowledge to never come back. Some criminals may say prison has been such a harrowing and life-threatening experience that I'm not going to risk it again. And that is a motivation to not offend anymore, or at least to not get caught. So maybe that's the issue. We know that pretty recently, we discovered that exactly like medical doctors and others, criminals burn out. There's criminal burnout. Believe it or not. There is the stresses, the cumulative stresses, the constant anxiety and so on, they lead to burnout. So maybe the burnout is the reason. The only minor problem is that we have no idea what is burnout and how does it operate. I'm sorry, but the whole field is iffy, to use another statement. Okay. And finally, there is maybe the good old disenchantment. The criminal grows out of crime. He's disenchanted with crime. He says, this way of life sucks. I no longer want to be a criminal. I want to be a professor of psychology, for example. And switches a career, has a family, and so on and so forth. We'll come to it in a minute. And settles down and desists, minimizes criminal activity. All this, everything I've just said, would have been wonderful as an explanation. You know, you age, your testosterone goes down, you have a family, you have experiences, and sounds wonderful. Sounds like a perfect explanation. The only problem is that criminals desist. They stop acting criminally in all the stages of the lifespan. Some criminals are very heavy criminals until age 18. Some stop all criminal activity at age 25. Some cease and desist at age 35. Some transition from street crime to white-collar crime at age 40. Some cease and desist in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. It seems that desistance is not correlated with aging, as we previously thought. It's a lifelong phenomenon, exactly like criminality. Criminality is lifelong, desistance is lifelong. Do we know why people commit crimes? No. Do we understand the mind of a criminal? No. Consequently, do we know why people desist? Why there is desistance? No. Do we know why there is desistance in different ages? No. Do we know why people reoffend? No. Simply no. We speculate. We have all kinds of inventions. Many of them are media hype. For example, society does not rehabilitate the criminal, doesn't give the criminal a chance. Many workplaces discriminate against people with criminal records, against ex-convicts, and so on, and that explains why they reoffend. This is nonsense. This is not founded on data. Actually, majority of criminals reoffend almost immediately. They don't give society a chance. They don't attempt to find work. They break the parole, the probation, and they reoffend. So there's a lot we don't know. The developmental view of crime, I find it a bit more interesting because I think it's much closer to reality. The slogan of the developmental view in criminology is you should take into account different stages of life and link them to variations in patterns of informal social control and social bonds. That was a mouthful. Allow me to translate it to English. What the developmental school tries to say is, in different stages of life, there are different factors, different inputs that either engender, foster, create criminal activity or encourage criminal activity. So throughout the lifespan, there is a confluence of circumstances, environment, peers, people in the criminal's life that push the criminal to offend or prevent the criminal from offending. And yet all of these are linked to social control and what is known as social bonds. As the number, intensity, and character of the social bonds varies, so does the criminal behavior. I find this concept very realistic and very fascinating. But to understand why, I need to explain to you what are social bonds. A social bond is a commitment to a goal that is approved by society. So for example, if you say, I want to get married and I want to have a child, that's a social bond. It's a commitment to a goal that society commends, approves of. If you say, I want to find a job and I want to save money and I want to buy an apartment, this is a social bond. So, social bonds allow society to regulate and control your behavior. The more committed you are to social goals, the more socially bonded you are, the more society controls you, your motivations, your attitudes, your beliefs, your values, your behaviors, who you are, your identity. Your identity emerges from the sum total of social bonds. It's a life plan. It's goals for life. And so the developmental view of crime is that criminals have very few social bonds. They are not committed to socially condoned or socially acceptable goals. They are committed to goals which society frowns upon, sanctions. They're committed, in short, to the wrong goals. And what the developmental view says, throughout the lifespan, there are many opportunities for a criminal to acquire social bonds, to commit himself to socially acceptable goals. You start as a criminal. Typically, you're a man. Statistically, you're a man. You start as a criminal, a heterosexual criminal. You meet a woman. You fall in love. At that moment, you are creating a social bond. You want to get married, maybe have children. That's a social bond. And this kind of social bond forces you, inhibits you. There's an inhibition. You will no longer offend because you want to have a family, or because you want to be with a woman with the love of your life, or whatever. Or you start off as a criminal, and then someone gives you a chance. Someone offers you a job. Someone appoints you to a position of authority and trust that may change the dynamics of your criminal mind, because it's a social bond. So what the developmental view says is that there are two dynamics at play, not one. There is the autonomous dynamic of the criminal mind, which is reactive to everything I've just described, and is lifelong, is throughout the lifespan, and has its ups and downs and so on. Escalation, opportunity, you name it. And there is another dynamic at play, and that is the dynamic of society, of social control, of social bonding, of life goals, of life plans. And the two interact. And by measuring or observing the interaction, we can absolutely predict criminal behavior and the reactions of the criminal's mind. That's according to the developmental view. They believe that social bonds create implicit and explicit obligations, restraints. They inhibition. It's an disinhibition theory. And so if you're committed to social bonds, if you have a job, if you acquired education, if you got married and so on, the costs and implications of committing a crime, of engaging in criminal activity, are substantially higher. And this is what generates the inhibition. The more social capital you possess, the less likely you are to offend or commit a crime. Of course, all these perspectives, the biosocial school, the developmental school, all these perspectives, fail to account for white-collar crime. Because white-collar crime is committed by people who already have numerous social bonds. It is committed by people who have never committed a crime before. So probably there's no hereditary component, no genetic component, no biological component, no neurological component. White-collar crime is the biggest enigma and mystery in criminology, because it flies in the face, it defies all the theories we have, no exception. They all fail when trying to account for white-collar crime. Similarly, crime that is committed in anomic societies. Anomic societies are societies where the norms and mores and conventions of behavior have collapsed. So, for example, Nazi Germany, yes? Or maybe Israel in Gaza. So in anomic situations, in anomic societies, where all the restraints and inhibitions and norms and laws and rules and expectations collapsed, crumbled, evaporated, in this situation, the individual finds himself without scripts, without guidance, doesn't know what to do. This enhanced state of uncertainty and indeterminacy creates crime. Crime flourishes in anomic societies. But is it typical crime? Does it mean if you commit a crime in an anomic society, does it mean that you have a criminal mind, let alone criminal genetics or genes? So there's a failure to account for societies that are falling apart, societies in crisis, societies in transition. There's a failure to account for this. There has been an explosion of crime in the former territories of the Soviet Union when it fell apart. And now the situation is dramatically better. So clearly, the anomy, the transition, the collapse of institutional collapse, the loss of institutional memory, they all had some impact on the crime rates. And they all somehow impacted the minds of individuals and converted them into criminal minds. I gave you an overview today of criminology. And it is an overview of lacunas, of deficiencies, of a vacuum at the core of the discipline. What we have been doing until now is reminiscent of the beginning of botany in the 18th century. There was a guy called Carl Linnaeus, and Carl Linnaeus was collecting samples of plants, and he invented a classification system, and he put the plants, he classified them. That is the state of criminology today. We are collecting criminals, serial killers, rapists, murderers, financial fraud, this, that, we're collecting them. Then we are observing them, then we are classifying them. It's a taxonomic. The science of criminology, discipline of criminology is taxonomic. We are very far, infinitely far, from understanding what truly happens in the criminal mind. How does society impact the criminal? What are the dynamics, psychodynamics, and mechanisms that lead to crime or stop the crime, desistance? Why people reoffend? Why people choose crime? Is it a choice at all? We don't know any. Why men and not women? We have no idea, no answer to these questions. On the one hand, it's a pitiable state, and claims to the contrary by criminologists are nothing short of hubris and grandiosity. On the other hand, it's an opportunity, because anyone who enters the field is very likely to have a disproportionate impact. Anyone who makes a contribution to the field of criminology will be remembered for long, because it's basically just starting. And so, if any of you are considering to enter the field, I encourage you. There are predecessors, of course, you have intellectual ancestors, there's a lot of literature, but you will find that you can easily, with relative ease, make substantial contributions to the field. Another problem with the field is that it is weird. Weird is an acronym, white and so on. The field is focused on Western societies, white people, middle class, males. And there is a neglect of crime in other settings, in other societies, with other skin colors, with other countries, in other periods of history, in other cultures and so on. Huge neglect. So any contribution you can make to establishing a kind of cultural criminology would be massive, much needed. We are just starting in psychology, actually, where we're introducing in psychology clinical considerations of cultural sensitivity. This is missing in criminology. And the connection between culture and crime is not clear. The connection between social dynamics and crime is not clear. The connection between historical memory and crime is not clear. Identity and crime, not clear, not clear, not clear. We know nothing, basically. And yet crime is prevalent. Crime is everywhere. We all end up committing crimes in our lifespan. It seems to be a totally normal behavior. Don't tell anyone, but it's a rational behavior. It pays big time. How come we know so little about crime and so much about, for example, sexuality? I think there is a reluctance to study crime because the truths that emerge from such study are highly uncomfortable, counterintuitive, politically incorrect. For example, I just mentioned crime pays. It's a rational decision, choice to be a criminal. And so there is this reluctance to delve deeper, to go all the way where the evidence leads you. I encourage you to do exactly this if you want to make a name for yourself in the field. Thank you for listening. I will take questions now if you have any. But I don't know if there is a chat section here. Let me see. Because the sound is regrettable. It's very difficult for me to hear you. I don't know if there's a chat. Okay. If you have any questions, there are two options. You can ask the questions now. I'll do my best to answer. Or you can write to my CIAPS email address. It is vakninsam, which is my name. You see my name at the bottom? Okay, so reverse, vakninsam @ciaps.org. Not too difficult to remember. Send me your questions. I'll be happy to respond. Additionally, on my YouTube channel, it's youtube.com /Sam Vaknin, my name, one word. On my YouTube channel, you can find several playlists of videos which deal with crime, malignant narcissism, so psychopathic narcissist, psychopathy, and there is a playlist called Contemporary Civilization, which deals also with aspects which have to do a lot with crime and criminality. So there's 1,800 videos there, and I'm sure you can easily find a few to suit your taste and to quell your thirst for knowledge and slake your thirst for intellectual stimulation. I hope. So if there are no questions, I'm grateful to you for your patience and for being present in this lecture. And I wish you the greatest success in your path forward, professional path and personal, of course. Thank you. I'll wait one more minute and then I will say goodbye. Okay. Have a nice day there, everyone, and take care.